Okay. So good morning, everyone. Today is August 2nd, 2026, and my topic today is called The Forms We Inherit, Zen, Trauma, and Inclusion. And I just want to say that in the past year and a half, I've been doing a real deep dive into trauma-informed practices, and I just want to share this book with you. It's called Trauma Sensitive Mindfulness, Practices for Safe and Transformative Healing by David Treleaven. You can see all of my nerdy notes on the side here. Those were the moments when I was reading the book that I was like, it was like an aha moment. And so I had to mark it so I could come back to it later. So I want to say that the majority of the technical information in my talk today is from this text. And if it interests you, I would encourage you to check this book out, because Treleaven is a meditation teacher and a trauma counselor as well too. So I think most of you know that I left my residency a year and a half ago, and it's amazing what can happen in a year and a half. And I was in Buddhist residency. My husband and I were in Buddhist residency for 6 years. And about 2 years into my 6-year residency, I found myself really wondering and curious about why certain aspects of traditional Zen practice felt uncomfortable. And so, for example, why do we turn and face the wall? And that's what we did there. We don't necessarily do that here, but if you go to other Zen temples, perhaps you may be invited to sit facing the wall rather than sit facing out. Why do we sit in such formal postures? In some communities, we use what's called the kiyosaku, or the encouragement stick, where the teacher comes around and hits you on your shoulders to help focus the mind. And what it does is it releases pressure in your body through pressure points. But why do we do that? Why is there an expectation of not moving during meditation? In residency or in certain communities, food and beverage, the purity of that is often strictly controlled. And also, what hierarchies are we creating through the forms that we preserve? And perhaps most importantly, and this is the one that continues to stick with me, is what happens when the forms we inherit carry assumptions about who belongs, what commitment looks like, or what a real practitioner looks like. And so, for a long time, I wondered if my discomfort meant that I somehow was doing Zen wrong. And I went to my first teacher to discuss this. And let me offer a very strong caveat here. I am a double Virgo, and I was trained by a professor who specializes in the teachings of Malcolm X. So this is not convenient, mainly for the people around me. So you could just ask my husband or my sister or Sean Sensei. I ask a lot of questions. And for those of you who follow astrology or who know me well, you may already understand where I'm going. I am so stubborn, but also I'm rather compassionate. I'm very defiant. I'm exceptional at organizing chaos. And I'm deeply called to unpack and remake the systemic inequities of the traditions that came before us. So in other words, if something has been done the same way for 500 years, I always ask, but why? And this sometimes creates problems. So when I brought these questions up to my first teacher, sometimes they were received, and other times they would not be. And sometimes my teacher would say, this is an opportunity for you to engage in deeper practice. Or, this is an opportunity for you to work with your repressed emotions. Or simply, let me just sit with this, Lani. So I never really received a clear answer. And so I begin to embody this narrative of perhaps I just needed to surrender more to the tradition. Perhaps my resistance was another obstacle to overcome. And perhaps the most honest one is if I just kept my damn mouth shut and sat quietly and accepted this is just how Zen is done, I would finally become a better practitioner, and unconsciously and later consciously, perhaps I would be as valued as those who didn't question the system. I'd also like to acknowledge my own part in all of this. I came into Buddhist residency from teaching 17 years in the public school system, and I came with many assumptions. I imagined that Buddhist communities would naturally be trauma-informed. I assumed Buddhist communities would be deeply engaged in community service and social justice. I assumed that we would investigate our privilege and willing to examine our own unconscious biases, racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, etc. I expected that using someone's pronouns would simply be an expression of right speech. And I assumed that we would have individuals from all walks of life, all areas of life, and everyone would be welcome, but also be invited to help shape the practice itself. So instead, I discovered that Buddhist communities are made up of human beings, really beautiful, sincere, devoted human beings who still are conditioned by the cultures in which we are raised. And just because we meditate, it does not mean that we are automatically free of bias and hierarchy and exclusion. But the practice does not exempt us from doing that work. The practice asks us to engage with these questions more honestly. And so this realization didn't diminish my faith in Buddhism. It actually deepened it. And the Dharma reminds me every day that it is never promised that practitioners will be perfect. And that includes myself. It invites us to keep waking up to ourselves, to one another, and to the suffering that exists in this world, including the suffering that we may unknowingly create. So one of the expected gifts of leaving my Buddhist residency and my first teacher, who I loved so deeply, and there was so much grief behind this, was the freedom that I was now able to explore these questions. When I was able to let go of trying to fit into a particular understanding or form of what real Zen was supposed to look like, I found more space to investigate what was actually alive and meaningful in practice. And I've traveled to so many different centers over this last year and a half. And what I'm learning is we are not asked to blindly accept every form, instruction, or tradition. But we are invited to investigate and to look closely and to ask questions like, does this support awakening for all beings, not just my own? Does this reduce suffering for all beings, not just my own? And does this create conditions where participants can be fully present, safe, and seen? And it's not just about me. Throughout history, practitioners have engaged with the Dharma through direct experience. And Zen has never been static. And it's traveled from India to China, China to Japan, and then Japan into America and Europe and beyond. And every single time Zen Buddhism has entered into a new cultural context, it is adapted. And we still preserve the heart of practice. The question before us is not simply how Zen survives in our contemporary world, but how it continues to evolve. How does it flow? This then invites us to examine the cultural assumptions that have shaped the transmission of Zen, and to ask who those assumptions may include, exclude, or overlook. So, for example, I talked earlier about facing the wall during practice. And for some people, that is a profound place where you can turn inward and let go of distraction. But for others, particularly those with trauma, isolation, marginalization, sitting facing the wall could bring up feelings of disconnection, vulnerability, or even trauma responses. And it's the same thing with the stick, with the kiyosaku. It's supposed to be a traditional expression of encouragement. But for those who have histories that include physical or sexual harm, the use of the stick, even the sound of the stick, may activate the nervous system rather than the deepening of practice. So the question becomes, let me rephrase that. The question is not, is this form good or bad? The question is, what is the purpose of this form? And does it serve the people who are practicing today? I remember a time when a neurodivergent student was asked to sit in the dining room alone, rather in the zendo, because they moved too much during meditation. And at the time, I never questioned that decision. Yet, upon reflection and upon reading and diving into Treleaven's work, a tremendous sadness came up for me. What stayed with me was the impact it had on this student. They experienced shame. The message they received was not simply, this particular form is not working for your body right now. The message they received was that their body did not belong in the zendo with the sangha. And so what does that do? What does that say about practice? What does that say about sangha? And, another example was around food purity. So a friend of mine was unable to participate fully in sesshin because his medical dietary needs required hard-boiled eggs, which this request did not fit within the center's vegan and gluten-free meal practices. And the intention behind the center's approach came from deeply held values around ethics and sustainability. However, because an accommodation would not be made, he would have been required to stay in a nearby hotel rather than remain with the sangha. This not only created an additional financial burden, but it also separated him from the community during one of the most meaningful aspects of retreat life. And so the question is not whether a dietary practice is right or wrong. It is whether our forms allow enough flexibility to meet people with compassion when their needs differ from the norm. When does our commitment to form make it harder for another person to experience welcome, safety, or connection? When does a community practice become so closely tied to the identity of the community, or the purity of the community, or the commitment of the community, that there's no longer room for people whose bodies require something different? And what messages do we unintentionally or intentionally send when someone's medical, physical, cultural needs are viewed as inconveniences rather than opportunities? And so Zen asks us to loosen our attachments And perhaps one of the deepest places to practice is with the forms themselves. Not abandoning them, but holding them lightly so that compassion can remain at the center. And this is where trauma-informed practice invites us into deeper reflection. And there are some people out there who feel like trauma-informed practice means making meditation easier or removing challenges or protecting people from discomfort. And it is none of those things. Trauma-informed practice begins with a simple recognition that every single person who walks through the door or comes on screen carries a history that we cannot see. Some bodies have learned that stillness is peaceful, and some practitioners find deep freedom in structure and ritual. But others find those same forms to awaken memories of control or punishment or exclusion. David Treleaven reminds us that meditation is not universally regulating. While contemplative practice can be healing, it can also activate traumatic stress responses when offered without sufficient awareness, support, or safety. And trauma-informed practice asks us to understand that the nervous system is a part of the practice. And this question is not whether someone is doing the practice correctly, but whether the conditions support the person's capacity to remain present without becoming overwhelmed or without moving outside of their window of capacity. And from a Buddhist perspective, this shouldn't surprise us. I mean, for over 2,500 years, Buddhism has taught us that our experiences are shaped by causes and conditions. Our habits, perceptions, emotions, reactions, they all arise from countless conditions that influence this moment. Trauma-informed practice simply recognizes that our nervous system and our lived experiences are among those conditions. So this is a real opportunity for us to shift some questions. So instead of asking, why can't this person sit still? We could ask, what conditions would allow this person to practice more fully? Rather than saying, well, this is the food we serve here, we could ask, how can we honor our community's values while also making room for practitioners whose medical, cultural, or nutritional needs are different? Rather than withholding certain types of foods and seeing that as an act of care, we might ask, what assumptions am I making about another person's body or health or relationship with food? Rather than viewing a neurodivergent body, a differently abled body, or a restless body as something to be corrected, we might ask, what would it look like to trust that this body too belongs in the Zendo and belongs in the community? And these questions aren't simply philosophy. They influence countless decisions within our own communities, and often in ways we don't even notice. Because over time, we become attached to forms, and we attach meaning to forms. So some of those forms, we attach the meaning of dedication, spiritual maturity, seriousness, where if people don't resonate with those forms, we attach judgment of compromise or lesser commitment. And I think an example of this is the relationship between do you sit in a chair and do you sit on a zafu? So for many people, the transition from a chair to a zafu represents a meaningful milestone. But it also invites an important question. What happens when we unintentionally make the zafu a better symbol or a symbol of better practice? What happens when we look at the chair as a lesser option rather than just skillful means? So in trauma support practice, we ask, are we honoring the form Or are we creating a hierarchy of bodies? The Zafu is a great tool. It supports stability, comfort, and awareness. The chair does the same. The Zafu itself is not the source of awakening. It's a vehicle that supports awakening, just as a chair does. So if somebody sits on a Zafu, that's great. If somebody sits on a chair, that's great. If somebody needs to move, adjust their posture, stretch, open their eyes, or find another way to practice with their body, that is also practice. We don't need to put labels of hierarchy and better and less than. The question is not whether someone can perfectly embody the form. The question is whether the form supports someone in meeting this moment. So, to shift just a little bit deeper, we've been examining the forms that surround meditation, but trauma-informed practice also invites us to examine the instructions we give, we receive, and practice within meditation. And again, if this interests you at all, David Treleaven goes into great detail about this within his book. Just as the Zafu is not inherently the practice itself, neither is the breath. For so many years, I just assumed that following the breath was a universal doorway into awareness because it's the instruction almost all of us have received. Yet, like every other form we have explored, the breath is received through unique causes and conditions of each person's life. And the breath is not neutral. So oftentimes when we first come to practice, we're instructed how to follow our breath, to return to the breath, to count your breath, because the breath is offered as a universal anchor. And for many people, it's that. It is for me. But, and this was a big moment for me, the breath is not always experienced as safe. David Treleaven reminds us that for some practitioners, bringing sustained attention to the breath can activate anxiety, panic, fear, or traumatic memories held within the body. Practices that ask someone to count their breath, lengthen their breath, or focus deeply on the physical sensations of the breath may not always create safety. For someone whose history includes experiences of suffocation, sexual assault, confinement, medical trauma, other forms of threat, the breath may carry a charge. And Treleaven connects it to some of the cultural events happening in the United States. So he illustrates this through the story of Freddie Gray, a young Black man whose death in police custody, and this was the Baltimore police, became a part of a national conversation about police violence, racial injustice, and systemic trauma. So if someone whose community or someone who has experienced those moments of suffocation or assault or whatnot, how can we really ask them to focus on the breath? And this isn't a political debate. It's a profoundly human question. How do our lived experiences shape the way we encounter meditation? At what point do we really need to consider that many of the traditions that we hold and use are not accessible for everyone, and maybe we should make some adjustments? So, for example, if I invite all of us to soften our gaze and to turn inward and notice the breath, this may feel like a refuge to you. But for others, based on their own causes and conditions, discrimination, violence, or the ongoing need to remain vigilant for their own safety, turning inward may bring them into contact with fear or grief or trauma activation that maybe is not the best place to go to right now. And I'm also not saying that we should never investigate our fear or grief or trauma. But again, if those things include us, we need to have the autonomy to say, I'm okay with going there. We have the agency to say, I'm okay with widening my window of capacity to deal with this today, or to work with this today, not deal. And so the nervous system does not exist apart from the world. Our nervous system activates because of what has happened to us, what has happened to others around us, and what has happened to the people who share our histories and identities. And that brings up that trauma is not just individual, it's historical, cultural, communal, and systemic. And that is why the breath is not neutral. The same meditation instruction that helps one person settle into presence may activate another person's nervous system. And this does not mean that either person is meditating incorrectly. It means that we're remembering that meditation happens within a human being. And every human being arrives carrying a history. So if this resonates with you at all in terms of the breath, Treleaven suggests that the anchor is not the goal. The breath is not the goal. The goal is present moment awareness without overwhelming the nervous system. So here are some alternatives that you may wish to experiment with if this resonates with you. So you can notice the feeling of your feet touching the ground. And you notice and connect with the stability and the connection to the earth. And if you're on a zafu, this is the way, the sides of your feet touch the ground, or the tops of your feet touch the ground. If you're not comfortable with the breath, or you want to try something new, sink into the stability of the feeling. Another one is a mala. If you have mala beads, just touching one bead to another, as if counting, or a mantra, or devotional prayer. This is another way to be in touch with the present moment that may not activate the nervous system as much if the breath does for you. There's also tuning into the environment. So the bell, the hum of a fan or an air conditioning unit, the bird song that you may hear outside, or just the sounds around you. Tuning into that could be a place of present moment awareness without overwhelming the nervous system. Another one could be orienting to the present moment by looking around the room, noticing colors, lights, windows, or objects that communicate safety and present moment awareness. You could also select a visual anchor within the room, just one, like the figure on the altar, a flower, a candle, something steady. And that could be your place of safety and present moment awareness. And also, if you like metta, may I be safe as the anchor. May I be happy as the anchor. May all beings be free from suffering as the anchor. The best part of all of this is the autonomy that you get to choose what is best for your practice. You know your practice better than previous teachers you may have had, more than I do, more than Sean Sensei does, more than Nikolai does. And so please bring your autonomy and your agency when you meet with us. Daisan and Doksan are opportunities for shared connection, and it's a practice point for people on both ends. And so we learn from one another. And that includes exploring autonomy and agency. So I'm going to begin to wrap up because I want to make sure we've got time to talk, but let me just end now. When I first began asking these questions during residency, I was worried that it meant I wasn't Zen enough or I lacked faith in the practice. And over time, I've found it is the exact opposite. Mitra Roshi once said to me, there are 84,000 Dharma gates and 1,000 arms of Kuan Yin, and not are identical. And that includes the forms we carry, our shared causes and conditions are individual causes and conditions. So there isn't a one-size-fits-all practice. It reminds me that Zen has never simply been about preserving the forms. It's about deepening practice. Forms are not the destination. They are skillful means. As I said, the Buddha adapted his teachings from the people to the people sitting in front of him. Originally, he didn't have women, but then he adapted thanks to Ananda. And then the Zen ancestors, they carried the Dharma from India to China, China to Japan, Japan to the United States, Europe, and beyond. And it always evolved. So every generation has inherited both a tradition and a responsibility to investigate what is essential and what can continue to evolve in response to the causes and conditions of our present moment. As teachers, priests, priestesses, Sangha members, our task is not only to preserve the form, but also to ask questions of them. Whose forms, who do these forms serve? Who might they be unintentionally leaving behind? What assumptions have become so familiar that we no longer notice them? And how might we embody the Dharma in ways that allow for even more beings to awaken? The Bodhisattva vows call for us to liberate all beings. That is, all beings. And I believe Zen Buddhism has room for people exactly as they are. And to me, that is the living Dharma. And I think that's what trauma-informed Zen practice asks us to do. So thank you. I appreciate your listening ears. And I'm going to stop the recording, and we'll have time for agreements, disagreements, any comments, all of that good stuff. And hopefully we can engage. So thank you.